Okay, getting good progress on the sanding. While I take a break from that, let me just walk you through the way a musket works. And this is very interesting. So remember, smoothbore musket, you're going to stick not just powder. You don't pour powder down the front, although in an emergency you could if you were poorly trained, as a lot of the revolutionary soldiers were on the colonial side. But actually, you made what they call cartridges, and we still call shotgun cartridges to this day. And it's just a small piece of paper, very lightweight paper, that is then folded in a particular way to have a packet of a pre-measured amount of powder. And then that paper is folded over into a cartridge. Now, when you're ready to fire, you bite off one end of that paper that has a small amount of powder just in it. And you're going to put that powder, I'll show you just here in a minute, in the pan. And the pan is what you're going to try to ignite. Then the rest of the paper has still within it the full load of black powder. You're going to shove that down the front of the barrel, and it's going to then get a ball in after. Sorry, I think you tap it all the way down first so that it's located. I'll show you where in just a second. Then you put a ball in, and then you are prepared to fire. Now let me show you how this all works. This is the replica musket firing mechanism that came with my musket. Now you can see here, it has a 1762 date on it. It has the symbol of, I actually don't know if that's supposed to be George, but it's a representation of the crown. So this is this is a regulated device. You couldn't just make these. You had to be regulated and approved by the crown. And so what you have here is a very, very sophisticated mechanism. Now I'll show you the pan. The pan is literally this little pan right here. That is where the little first amount of powder that you bite off with your teeth, and then pour that powder just right into there. Now you're holding the musket like this so that the pan actually allows you can see the slight indentation of the pan allows the powder to sit there. And you see that small hole next to it. That small hole is where the powder will hopefully be close enough to that hole when it gets lit on fire by the strike of the flint and steel. And then on the other side of that hole is the inside of the barrel. And that's where you've just pounded the black powder and the ball in there. So you're causing a fire out here, which causes a spark, which then goes inside the barrel. And instead of all of that gunpowder shooting out that tiny hole, when it explodes through the barrel, pushing the ball all the way out, and hopefully, as many as 100 feet in some fashion, kind of close to where you aimed it. Now, what you got to see here is the mechanism. The mechanism here, you've got three pieces to it. I'll see if I can do this while I'm holding it with one hand. These require, I'm not going to be able to do that. I got to hold that. Cock that into one position. Cock that into the second position. All right, now that sets the trigger. This is a single trigger model. There were two trigger models that I'm not familiar with. The single trigger is the more common one from the era. Now, what you've got here is a spring action set off by this trigger that will release this and allow it to come forward. But what's it going to strike when it gets close to the pan? Well, you got to load that as well. And so you put the steel here. You have your flint and you have your steel. Now I'm going to release the trigger. There's no powder in here, so all it's going to do is click. But watch what happens. See if I can get close enough that you can see the spark. You saw that spark. Cool, huh? That spark, I can even smell it, if there had been gunpowder in the pan, would likely have ignited the powder. You'd get a misfire either because the pan doesn't flash, is the term that they use, or because the pan flashed, but it didn't penetrate into the tiny little hole so that it ignited the powder inside the barrel of the gun. And that could be a misfire. Now, if, as I said, you're a British soldier, you trained on this every day, and the likelihood of a misfire is 1 in 10, 1 in 20. If you're an American colonial, your likelihood of a misfire is much higher. A couple of reasons. You might not have good cartridges prepared. You might have to be pouring powder, and so getting the right amount of powder in the right location is harder. Your flint and steel might not be as rigorously maintained as they were maintained in the Army. So, this flint is going to break off. I've fired it a couple of times here without any powder, so I'm not to that point yet. just testing it, and it breaks the flint. So you got to have the flint right there. And then, of course, you got to keep the whole thing clean so that you can see how much powder you've put in, and you can see whether the steel is causing the spark that it needs to spark, and so on. Very, very complicated mechanism, but really amazing for its time. Amazing in its ability to reliably get off, like I said before, about 6 shots in a minute for a very well-trained soldier, maybe 3 shots for a decently trained colonial, 2 to 1 shot for someone who is not trained in this at all, and maybe was only using their musket to shoot an occasional deer, in which case they wouldn't have ever drilled rapid loading and firing anyway. That is the musket firing mechanism.
Now, welcome back to the narrator part of our video here. I've got a couple of minutes before I interrupt myself to explain about the production process. But in those couple of minutes, here's where I was coming into early July. After having planned for months that I was going to go through what I expected to be a complicated and potentially frustrating process of applying for a license to carry, come the beginning of July, because of the Supreme Court decision, everything had changed. Everything is now easier in the state of Massachusetts at the time being. And so as a result, my journey was rather simple. Second week of July, I downloaded a form from my town, which the town ultimately by state law has the authority to grant me a license, filled out that form, registered for a gun safety course, which I have to take, and I'll come and describe that to you in a moment, and then filed the application with the town, all of which I'll give you detail on in just a second.
Okay, got it hanging up here. I just finished the sanding and try to get as much of the sawdust off as I can so it's drying while it hangs here above my shop. If you saw in the little sequence there, I was using my Dremel to try and sand some of the smaller bits that are harder to reach with actual just hand sandpaper. That Dremel's going to come in handy, I think, because I'm going to try to do some engraving. Probably going to add some design work to the stock, the butt of the stock, and maybe even some metal engraving. There's a couple of pieces that you could do an engraving on. I've already shown you the engraving that comes with it to make it a replica of a 1762 musket, but I'm going to want to personalize it a little bit more than that. So let it stop and dry, and we'll come back to stain it later on.
The first step after downloading my application from the town is to fill it out. Now, this is a pretty straightforward form. It's only a couple pages long in the first place, even under the prior laws in the state of Massachusetts. I have to give them my address, my parentage, basic physical description of myself, 6'2", and so on and so on. My job, my driver's license number, the social security number is optional, and I give them contact details of my place of work. Then I have to answer a bunch of questions about whether I'm a citizen, and if naturalized, I have to present evidence of that. Whether I've ever renounced my U.S. citizenship, I have to disclose my age. You have to be 21 to apply for a license. And then whether I have ever been arrested or appeared in court as a defendant. Am I subject currently to any pending criminal charges? Have I been convicted of a felony? Have I been convicted of unlawful use, possession, or sale of controlled substances? Have you ever been convicted of a violent crime or a crime of domestic violence? Have you ever been convicted as an adult or adjudicated a youthful offender or delinquent child in any state or federal jurisdiction? Are you now, or have you ever been the subject of a restraining order? Are you currently the subject of any outstanding arrest warrant? Have you been committed to any hospital or institution for mental illness or alcohol or substance abuse? Has any firearms license issued under the laws of any state or territory ever been suspended, revoked, or denied? And have you been discharged from the armed forces under dishonorable conditions? Or have you been the subject of an order of the probate court appointing a guardian or conservator? Now, for those questions, for someone like me, it's pretty easy to answer. I recognize that that's not the case for everyone else. And that, in fact, as I would later learn, when I went to my gun safety course just a few weeks later, that was something that was not the case for a lot of people who were seeking firearms licenses, and I had to think through that. It's very easy for me to say I'm a very trustworthy and loyal person to the United States because all of these things are easy for me to answer. Not the case for everyone else. The rest of the application, I have to list 2 references that I'm going to ask to write letters on my behalf, which I then collect and deliver to the police department that vouch for my character. And there's some language about that they specifically ask for. They're supposed to say whether they think that I will use my license to carry appropriately. That language used to be more complicated because under the restricted license regime prior to the Supreme Court decision, I would have to be in a position to ask my some of my references to describe why I need one. And that's no longer the case. So it does change a little bit what the references are being asked to do. And then this is the part of the application that no longer technically applies, but it's still in the application, which is what is your reason for requesting the issuance of a card or license? And you have to specify I want an unrestricted one, a sporting one, a target hunting one, or I'm going to use it for my employment. Now basically, lawyers and other gun control advocates will tell you, gun rights advocates will tell you, always mark unrestricted and leave the explanation blank. I actually filled mine in just because I'm that kind of person. Like when I see a police pulling up behind me, I think, oh, I must have done something guilty. That's just my personality. So when I was looking at this explanation, I said, well, I got to explain it. And I just said, I'm conducting research on gun ownership for a project that I'm doing, which is, true. I didn't explain the musket. I didn't explain all that stuff. But this is legitimately what I'm trying to do here. Okay, got the stain on. Got it ready to go. Give it a couple of days, and then we'll put on a polyurethane finish on it. Then we'll be ready to go. You're looking at it here, where I have it hung to dry. Once I filled out the application, I brought a copy of the application with me to my gun safety course. Now, the gun safety course I had to register for. I actually looked into this maybe 15 years ago, and it was really, really hard to find gun safety courses that were certified by the state that had enough classes. That has changed dramatically, and I don't know if it's because the certification process done by the state is different or if just the demand for courses is up. I would later hear from my own police department that the number of applications in my fairly peaceable town has gone up dramatically in the last 4 or 5 years. In fact, when I went to pick up my license to carry, there was a stack of them ready for citizens to come pick them up. There must have been 30, 40 in envelopes stacked up, and the officer had to search for mine from the pile. So maybe because there's so much demand that new courses have sprung up. But I had to drive about an hour away from my home to find a course, and it's offered in a completely enclosed concrete building that has 2 firing ranges built into it, classrooms there, as well as a gun retail outlet in the front of the place. So you can buy your guns there. You can sign up to be part of the gun club so that you can use the firing range, which I guess is how it works here for people who want to go do target practice and things like that. I really could do a whole essay on the process of going through the gun safety course. It was very interesting. I took very in-depth notes about who was in the room, what their situations were as far as I could overhear in their conversations. I would say about 1/4 of the people there were immigrants to the United States. I heard Portuguese, I heard Spanish. There were at least a couple Ukrainian people in the room. I can't remember exactly. I have to look at my notes, but it was about 25 people total for the course that I was taking. And it was just a long one-shot, multiple hour-long afternoon course. The course was fascinating. The instructor's a local guy, African-American descent, who along the way teaches us what we're supposed to know to legally use a firearm, make sure we understand our legal rights and obligations, make sure we know how to fire the weapon, because we're later going to go fire it on the test range, and we have to pass so that we can, in some towns, used to require that you brought a signed copy of your target to show that you could strike the target some number of times out of 5 or 10 or whatever. My town never required that, and I don't know if that's still legal under the current Supreme Court regime. But that those kinds of things that's his job, is to make sure everyone knows how to not get in legal trouble because you think, oh, now that I have a gun, a license to carry, it means what? So there's a lot of classroom instruction on how to do that. But also his politics would come into it, of course, because, of course, these are all people seeking firearms. So there's no one there, at least unless they're, investigative journalists, there's no one there who is opposed on principle to the idea of possessing firearms. So his politics would come out quite a bit. And he said himself, it was only a couple of years ago that he decided to become a firearm safety instructor. He had been in the military, and so that's where he got his initial training on firing weapons. And then he had also been in private security for a period. He was a bouncer for a while. It was just interesting to hear his perspective on it. He has decided, as I think some people have, that the world is becoming a more dangerous place and that we, to keep ourselves safe, need to have firearms. Now, I do not feel that way. Yes, crime is up. You won't know this about me, but in the 1990s, I did a lot of research about people's perceptions of crime. This was a really common thing for people in mass communications research PhD programs to look into. There's a whole thing in the 70s and 80s called the cultivation hypothesis, which involves people's perception of fear. Because remember, in the 80s, crime was out of control in major metropolitan areas in the country. It was absolutely awful. And it started to go down for reasons that people are still trying to explain. And all through the 90s was going down. But people's perception of the crime rate did not go down, even as the crime rate went down. Anyway, yes, the last few years, the crime rate has gone back up, in particular the homicide rate. Although the victims of homicide have not been random in the last, mostly ever, but the increases of the last 2 years have been in known communities and that are challenged. So there's a lot of research-related implications to what's happening with the rise of firearms, weapons, crime, and so on. But the fact is, we're nowhere near where we were at the peak of crime in the 1980s, nowhere close to it. And yet people are out there saying, I need to have a weapon to defend myself. I personally, I'm not ready to do that, to use a weapon to defend myself. But I know plenty of people who are, and plenty of people who have trained for that. And, I respect them. They're good people. Okay, so this is where I am. I've only gotten up to the point where I've described going through the safety course. I haven't even gotten to the broader thoughts about it. I will try to do that in video 3. Right now, what you're about to see, here it is the drying firearm, the musket, with the polyurethane on it. It looks lovely. If you're a real woodworker, my apologies for everything you're looking at here. But anyway, stay tuned for video 3.
While I let that dry, it's going to look really nice there. Now I have to go research the steps that I'll cover in my next video, which is how to get a hold of black powder, for which I do need a license to carry, and I have one. I have to learn how to properly fire the weapon and where I'm legally allowed to do so in Massachusetts. I'm not 100% sure where that will be. I know I can go to a commercial firing range, and that is an option, although I don't know if I can film there. Anyway, so very, very eager to make my next steps along the way and see what we can do here with this wonderful brown Bess.